Welcome, everyone, to the Restructuring program. My name is RX, and I'm really excited to present to you today an introduction into our flagship course, the Restructuring program, where we go over the very basics, the foundations of restructuring that will really teach you everything that you need to know to get ready for interviews, etc., or whether you're just interested in restructuring as well. So starting off with my background here. I started my career as an investment banking analyst working in restructuring in special situations before moving to a hedge fund seat recently. I left my seat to pursue the Perry Pursue newsletter full time as of late, and I started writing the newsletter in January 23. Today, we've published over 200 editions. I've also been honored to contribute two chapters in the leading LME practitioner textbook on LMEs. And as you probably understand right now, I really do love restructuring. I have a passion for teaching. And after many years of requests from every group, every reader of our newsletter, which we appreciate so much, I finally finished our restructuring program, which I'm incredibly excited to present to you today. Our approach to the restructuring education program follows a structured method. As you know, there really is no perfect way to recruit for restructuring today. PDFs are very short. It's a shortcut, frankly, that doesn't teach you the full concepts that we think you need to know. The few colleges that do have classes, a lot of times they use legacy materials that don't even apply to interviews today. And even on the books, which I've read them all and I love them all equally, they're at the end of the day still a legacy resource, which will take too much time and doesn't prepare you to actually interview. So ultimately, I decided to create the restructuring program with these problems in mind to help you build a deep and flexible understanding of the key concepts while doing this in a time efficient and interview focused manner. The program will include over 30 hours of lectures where I'll be teaching you every single concept. We're starting off with the very, very basics, the truly beginner, to anything that you need to recruit for and work in a restructuring role. After each chapter, you're going to have a list of common interview questions to validate your understanding. And these are questions you can very well expect to see on the job or while trying to land a seat in restructuring banking. And finally, for people who are interviewing at the lateral level, we've also included a real-life restructuring case with a model and presentation to reflect some of the work that you might have to do to land a seat in that setting. So here we have an overview of each of the chapters. You can see we start from the very scratch, the introduction to restructuring, the restructuring 101. We build from the very foundational concepts to the most advanced topics that are going to be tested in interviews and the job. So let's spend a little time going into each of them in detail. Starting off with our introduction in restructuring, we're going to be going over the very, very high level of things. What is restructuring? Who operates in the landscape? What are the firms? How does it differ from M&A advisory? How does it differ at bulge brackets versus elite boutiques? And then we'll start to pivot into the role of an analyst. What will you be doing? What types of mandates will you be working on? And frankly, why is it even attractive to participate in a restructuring career as an analyst? Why is it something that so many people are recruiting for? Finally, we'll end off by going over an overview of the credit cycles to really lay the land for the later chapters that I'll get into shortly, and give a little primer on the restructuring solutions that we'll spend so much of this course going over. Chapter 2, as we'll get into next, that is going to be focused on constituents and mandates. These includes both debtor, creditors, and all other parties involved, thinking of unsecured creditor committees, ad hoc and steering committees, judges, trustees, etc., and how it's very difficult but important to get all of these constituents in alignment to be able to effectuate a restructuring. In chapter three, we're going to be pivoting to the capital structure and claim priority. So trying to understand how our capital structure is organized. Yes, there is the very high level way of the absolute priority rule, which we'll be going over. But there's other ways that capital structures can be organized. Things like structural subordination, contractual subordination, temporal subordination, and equitable subordination all impact these. And that's really what this chapter is going to be focused on. In chapter four, we pivot to understanding leveraged finance foundations. So going over the types of credit that can be issued, bonds versus loans, going over bank loans in terms of revolvers and term loans, as well as some of the more higher yielding pieces of debt, like mezzanine financing. We'll then pivot a little bit into understanding the types of covenants associated with credits that will really lay the land for a lot of the LME analysis that we'll be doing later on, as I'll get into shortly. In chapter five, we then lay the very basics to understand bond math, and yield fundamentals. I think this is actually something very important, especially for interviews. It's one of the first things that is tested because understanding credit and understanding restructuring really starts with a good understanding of the yield on a credit. So we'll teach you how to calculate yield, how bond price and yield work together and the relationship between it, the concepts of duration and convexity, and really how to look at a piece of yield, look at a capital structure, and draw certain conclusions from it. In chapter six, we start to put together all the things we've covered in especially the past few chapters and go through a live case study throughout the chapter to build a cap table looking at a single company. We'll be doing the very basics of a cap table, going into liquidity builds, maturity wall analysis, interest coverage ratios, etc. From there on out, once we have an understanding of the basics of capital structures and leveraged finance, we can then pivot to how everything plays together in distress. We'll be looking at operational versus financial distress, what are some common red flags, and the market signals of distress as well. We then will look at some of the corporate pressures and catalysts building on that last chapter, thinking of some of the primary versus secondary triggers that can actually catalyze a company into bankruptcy. These are things like maturity walls, interest payments, black swan events, credit market contractions, investor activism, just to name a few. And with that out of the way, now that we've laid the land for how a company can actually enter distress, we'll now pivot in chapter nine into going over the basics of in-court bankruptcies. And this is a very, very in-depth chapter that we'll be spending so much time on because it's very critical to the overall reorganization process. We'll start from the very basics of what a bankruptcy filing looks like, the way companies can file, whether that's prepackaged versus prearranged versus free fall versus involuntary, and then start to get into some of the considerations involved with filing, things like DIP financing, bankruptcy provisions, Section 363 sales, and ultimately end off with a case study of one of my personal favorite bankruptcy cases, the case study of Yellow Trucking Company. After that, Chapter 10 will go towards the second half of in-court bankruptcies, and that's focusing on how to actually get a plan approved and how to reemerge from bankruptcy. It's one of the most unique features of the United States Bankruptcy Code. It's really designed to help companies reorganize and emerge as a going concern. So we'll look at what that process looks like, from developing a plan of reorganization to getting enough voting, hitting the voting thresholds by creditors. What to do if you don't hit those voting thresholds by creditors, but still want to get a plan approved. Things like exit financing, rights offerings, and ultimately understanding what the pros and cons are of the system. After we've covered our in-court section, we can then pivot to understanding out-of-court restructurings. And this will be broken up into two chapters, chapter 11 and 12. In chapter 11, we'll lay out some of the key considerations to understand what out-of-court restructurings look like at a very high level. We'll be looking at some of the main mechanisms like amend and extends, debt for debt exchanges, debt for equity exchanges, etc. And in chapter 12, we'll use all of those concepts that we've just talked about to understand what everyone is interested about in restructuring liability management exercises. We're going to be going over every single key mechanism that's going on in the market today, whether that's up tiers, drop downs, double dips, triple dips, pari plus structures, extend and exchange structures, sponsor down tiers, and ultimately really try to understand the role of LMEs in the bank organization process. After we've finished our out of court chapter, we can then start to look at distressed debt as an asset class. We'll start to take a very high level view of what distressed in debt investing looks like, how it's looked at like historically, what the different asset classes are, such as CLOs and CDOs, for example, and try to understand what the role of distressed investors are, how they specialize and create value and alpha for their returns for their clients ultimately. After we've laid out distressed debt as an asset class, we'll then start to understand distressed investing frameworks. We're going to be looking at one of the leading founders, I would say, of distressed investing, Martin Whitman, and the creation of Third Avenue, one of the most well-known initial distressed funds of all time. We're going to go over the very basics of distressed investing and see how it's a form of value investing at its very core. Then in chapter 15, after we've gone over the basics of distressed investing, we'll pivot to an understanding of how valuation works in restructuring. Because whether you're doing it for banking roles or investing roles like we've just talked about in the last couple of chapters, valuation drives everything at the end of the day. It's how you determine who gets paid what. So we're going to be going over some of the basic valuation methods that you need to do not only in distress, but in any sort of setting when you're trying to value a company. We're going over some of the desktop valuation methods, whether that's discounted cash flows, trading comps, precedent transactions, and then some of the restructuring specific valuation methods, like negotiated versus market-based versus the legal arguments that can be used sometimes. In chapter 16, we're going to take a little bit of a pivot here and focus on some accounting issues that we see in restructuring. A lot of times it's not the same things that you would see for a very healthy company, and is very much worth spending some time going over some of the key accounting differences you would see in a healthy versus distressed company. Things like goodwill impairment, PIK interest, synthetic PIK, covenant adjusted EBITDA versus normal EBITDA, working capital dynamics, etc. Then in chapter 17, we're going to be spending a lot of time going over a very important topic called structural subordination. This really sits at the heart of all out of court and in court mechanics, and really everything that this entire course up until now has been building on. We'll be going over how to think about corporate organizational structures, specifically in terms of holdco versus opco structures. We'll be understanding things like guarantees, whether that's a downstream or upstream guarantee. We'll look at restricted versus unrestricted subsidiaries and ultimately end off with a set of interview questions that you can expect to see. Then in chapter 18, we will be spending some time going over constituents' motivations and negotiations. Up until now, we've really been focused on the mechanics of restructuring, but especially as you think about how transactions are effectuated, it's ultimately being able to manage the people involved. And that's what we're going to be looking at. What are the motivations of those peoples, whether it's debtor, creditors, equity holders, trade creditors, etc. Then in chapter 19, we're really going to be going into a very, very long deep dive into modeling and restructuring case studies. These are things you would need for lateral interviews or hiring for junior analyst investment banking roles. We're going to be going over a live modeling case study where we give you a prompt and ask you to do it yourself, and we go over it ourselves as well. We also go over a restructuring proposal case study where you're asked to propose a potential restructuring for a company that we've given, and we actually go through the live walkthrough of that as well. We then also go over a set of 5 different quote unquote iconic case studies in Serta, Pluralsight, Trinseo, Spirit, and American Tire, which all give sort of a culmination of everything that we've covered in this course so far. And to wrap it up, we actually have a guest lecture. We're very happy to have someone who is now a co-founder and partner at ENS Partners and a former partner in the special situations and restructuring group at PJT Partners, and a former senior managing director at Blackstone, Mark Bushman. He we're very grateful that he took the time to speak with us, and we're very excited for you to see an insight into the restructuring industry that, well, you frankly cannot get anywhere else. So again, thank you very much for attending our info session here. If you're curious to see about how the program looks from the inside, you can see a class preview at the bottom of this page where you also see some common FAQs. I hope this presentation was very comprehensive, but again, I'm here to help. I've been making restructuring content for over 5 years at this point, and I'm really excited to hopefully hear how this program helped you get a great restructuring job. If you have any questions not addressed in the FAQ, feel free to email me at info@restructuringcourse.com. Thank you to everyone, and I very much look forward to learning together.